Welcome again, listeners to Community Radio, Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rmb.org.au. Our program, Community Voices. I'm your host, Michael Lester. There's a lot of talk these days about a crisis in democracy. It's almost a worldwide crisis, it seems, in liberal democracies, but particularly being confronted, I guess, in the United States of America, not least with the looming presidential election on the 5th of November. It's a cliche, but it's being styled as one of the most important elections of the present generation. That might well be true. Nevertheless, it seems now that the battle between Trump and Kamala Harris seems to be very evenly poised on the basis of national polls. Some are describing it as an election subject to the butterfly effect, the well-known idea that small changes in small places in this case could have very, very large effects, given the equal balance in the national polls. It does give rise to a lot of interesting questions as we watch the progress of this campaign towards 5 November about the state and health of American democracy, and particularly the integrity and stability and robustness of its institutions to withstand the sort of pressures under which it's labouring. Pleased to welcome to the programme again Amelia Lester, Deputy Editor of Foreign Policy magazine out of Washington, D.C., currently based in Sydney. Thanks again, Amelia, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Amelia, since we've last spoken, with the accession of Kamala Harris as the presidential Democratic nominee, the polls have been pretty much neck and neck running, but there's been a lot of campaigning and activity. How would you characterize over the past few weeks the campaigning strategies, and particularly Donald Trump's reaction to the sort of momentum and coverage that Harris has managed to achieve?
I heard an interesting quote the other day in a Politico article that was interviewing Fox News's election caller. He's the sort of Anthony Green of the United States. He became famous in 2020 when he called Arizona for Joe Biden before anyone else did. And that got him a lot of conservative backlash because he was on a conservative network. His name is Anand Mishkin, and he had a very interesting comment on the dynamic of this election in this Politico interview where he said, this election is about Donald Trump. And what I took that to mean is that Donald Trump is a get out the vote machine for Republicans. He is a get out the vote machine for Democrats. And no matter who the Democratic nominee is, whether it's Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, doesn't ultimately matter very much, which is why the polls have been so neck and neck this whole time. What matters is how the electorate is feeling about Donald Trump. So in a sense, whatever campaigning strategy Kamala Harris adapts is almost beside the point, because this election has always been about Donald Trump. That said, Kamala Harris has had an uphill battle in forming the same coalition that Joe Biden used to narrowly win victory in 2020. And increasingly, we're seeing analysis saying that she has not succeeded, according to the polls, in bringing that coalition together. If we break down the different constituent parts of that coalition, she is receiving less support from Hispanic voters, less support from Black voters, certainly less support from men across the board, and only comparable support to Joe Biden in 2020 with young voters and with women. The only group that she's seen an increase in support from is white college graduates. And that group is not really enough to swing the election, since they tend to be clustered in urban areas in blue states. So that's the sort of reason people are giving for why in the last week or so, the very close polls have broken for Donald Trump. Now, it's again very narrow for him too, but that has been the trend in the last week.
What reactions or changes have we seen in Trump's campaigning strategy and style since Kamala Harris has come on the scene? Has his strategy and style changed and the sort of things he's doing, or is it just the same old that we've seen from Trump?
I want to be very careful in ever ascribing strategy to what Donald Trump is doing. By the admission of the people around him and of Trump himself, he does what he wants to do. And I think it's safe to say that this has not been an extremely disciplined campaign from him. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen some really strange occurrences. For 40 minutes, he swayed back and forth to music ranging from YMCA to Ave Maria at a rally in Pennsylvania when there was a medical emergency in the crowd. Just this week, he paced a stage in Nevada for 20 minutes while dealing with a microphone malfunction without saying anything, just walking back and forth. Very strange behavior, and I don't think it's the kind of behavior that anyone would say is a strategy. his campaign has been trying. I mean, I think this week his pit stop in a McDonald's, where he worked, quote unquote, at the closed McDonald's for an hour, was intended to both be a sort of compelling photo op, which it was. I mean, the photos went around the world, but also to highlight what he's been trying to hammer, which is Kamala Harris's inauthenticity. Kamala Harris worked in the summer of 1983 at a McDonald's in Washington, D.C. when she was a student at Howard University. She's talked about that a lot to sort of establish her working person bona fides. Trump, without evidence, has claimed that she was lying about that. So him working at the McDonald's, I think, was meant to highlight that kind of sense that the electorate still has, where they maybe don't know Harris very well. Maybe they feel that she's inauthentic in some way. But again, I think ascribing a strategy to what he's doing is folly.
One measure of the health and integrity of a liberal democracy is voter participation, and turnout is obviously a key variable in the outcome, not least of this election. Interestingly enough, I understand that the last election, 2020, had the highest ever voter turnout at nearly two-thirds, 66%, some 150, 160 million people, but still one-third of the population didn't vote. So I'm wondering how the voting turnout is looking at this stage. Can we tell? So, for example, the early pre-polling and early voting seems to suggest around 20 million people voting already, and that's continuing to grow in the next 2 weeks. So what can we sense about the turnout and how it's going to be going?
Just before I answer on how it's going this time around, one piece of context that I always like to give for Australians is that it's harder to vote in the US than it is in Australia. So when Australians look at that one-third number of people sitting out elections, I think it's worth reminding people that US elections happen on a Tuesday. A lot of people who work in the US don't have protections around their ability to take time off work to vote. They might be working shift work where they can't take the time off. And until 2020, there were very few postal vote allowances made for people who wanted to vote before the election. The other thing I want to mention about why it's harder to vote in elections in the US is that you routinely see very long lines at voting booths. And when voting isn't compulsory, and when maybe you're taking time out from childcare or, again, working a shift at a place where you don't have a lot of flexibility in your work, the prospect of standing for sometimes hours in a line to vote is not an especially appealing one. And in a lot of red states, Republican-controlled states, there's been legislation passed to make it even harder to vote under those conditions. For instance, in Georgia, it is now illegal to give someone who is standing in a line to vote water or any food, even when there have been instances in Georgia of people standing in line for 7 hours to vote. So that's just the context for why you do see relatively few people voting in the US. But yes, it's true that in 2020, the numbers were higher than ever before. And I think it goes back to that observation of Fox's Anand Mishkin that when Trump is on the ballot, the election is about Trump because he drives out Democrats, he drives out Republicans. I think we will see equally high numbers this time, if not more. Certainly the early indications are that people are really taking advantage of those pandemic era introduction of making it easier to vote early and to vote by mail. People are really picking up on that, including Republicans. In 2020, Trump discouraged Republicans from voting by mail. Don't really know why. This time around, they're not making that same mistake. They're encouraging their supporters to get out early to vote. So I would not be surprised if this is the highest voter participation ever in an American election.
Yeah, well, as you point out, the other side of voter turnout encouragement is voter suppression, particularly those obviously you don't want to vote. And although you rejected, or not rejected, balked at the idea that Trump might have any sort of strategy in what he's doing, it could almost be seen as a de facto strategy by Republicans at different states to actually engage proactively in voter suppression. Some of the devices you've mentioned and many others, including, providing relatively few booths in areas and undermanning the booths so the queues go on forever. So that certainly appears to be a bit of a de facto strategy.
And also making it harder to register, putting the voter registration deadlines very early in the summer before people have even really thought about the election, demanding that they bring particular forms of ID to the voter booth. Just to sort of push back or maybe double down on what you're saying, I agree that on a state level and in terms of the Republican Party machinery, there is absolutely a strategy. But I was saying that Trump himself does not have a strategy. The people around him absolutely have oodles of strategy.
In terms of Trump and the focus on Trump, and it's all about Trump and maybe there's a lot of truth in that, I'm sure, but there's been some interesting statistics I've seen recently quoted that are used for the basis of a statement that the era of well-liked presidential candidates may well be over forever, because apparently, despite the recent Gallup polling, for example, that puts favorability ratings for Trump at 50% and Harris at about 48% on favorability rankings. Apparently, historically, these favorability rankings have never been lower for presidential candidates. Back in the 70s and 80s, the presidential candidates used to have favorability rankings of 70 and 80%. Maybe people are just losing interest in the two main parties and their candidates, a bit like we've seen in Australia. Interesting angle of that too, apparently, is that although they've lost popularity, these presidential candidates in the overall electorate, their popularity within their own individual parties seems to be as high than it's ever been.
Yeah. I don't think that it's the same phenomenon as we're seeing here with people losing interest in the main parties per se. What I think is happening is the polarization of the electorate and the fact that people are in their camp and they're not moving from their camp. So that's why we'll never see the 70 or 80% approval ratings again, because people will never cross over party lines anymore in the way that they used to. I think also the likability of Trump, it's certainly worth pointing out. I agree. He is not popular. He was not popular in 2020. He's not popular now. It's almost as though people don't like the idea that their vote is being discounted or not validated.
Yeah, our guest here on Community Radio Northern Beaches, Community Voices, is Amelia Lester, Deputy Editor of Foreign Policy Magazine. We're talking about the progress towards 5th November presidential elections in America and what it might be telling us about the state and health and integrity of the American democratic establishment and institutions. Another issue that's pretty important in all this, in the integrity of the system, is the funding of elections. We've seen, I think, reported that in the last 3 months, the Democratic Harris campaign has spent a record $1 billion. It's kind of hard to believe that. That's American real dollars on its campaigns. Apparently, the other side, the Trump side, has spent only a small proportion of that. What is this spending and the significance of it in a democratic system? Is it having a big impact, this big money spending?
I think that's a good question. And there are certainly people who think that the whole machinery around elections has gotten out of control, and maybe TV advertising, which is the lion's share of that spend, doesn't even move the needle anymore. To the earlier point about how entrenched people are in their beliefs, it's not clear that those old-fashioned ways of reaching voters, but which take up a lot of money, are even that effective anymore. I'd say the other reason why I think that Harris has had to spend so much is because this is an unprecedented election cycle in the sense that she only came onto the ticket in the summer. So normally you see 18 months of the spend can maybe be distributed over that 18 months of the candidate first running for the nomination and then becoming the nominee, the presumptive nominee, much earlier. I think that the challenge that the Harris campaign has had is trying to bring the American people up to speed on who this candidate is in a very small amount of time. Now, there are some commentators, Julian Zelizer, who's a historian at Princeton who writes for foreign policy, argues that maybe this shorter election cycle is better for democracy because it means that you ultimately spend less money and there's just a less bloated machinery around the whole thing, and there's no need to have that ballooning 18-month election cycle. And he hopes that the Harris campaign, if they're victorious here, will prove that you don't need to have that kind of 18-month cycle. Of course, if she loses, I think that people will point to the shorter duration of her candidacy and say that was the problem, and we won't see any change in the status quo.
Well, of course, money always speaks, and particularly speaks in America and in the political system. And although there are rules about limits on donations and what have you, there seem to be all sorts of huge loopholes, not least, for example, with corporations being able to spend as much as they like advertising on behalf of any candidate. I mean, they're not passing the money directly to the candidates, but they can spend as much as they like and presumably do. But we've also seen moving in here some big-time billionaires with their money. We've seen Elon Musk move in with his $1 million a day lottery to try and presumably encourage Republicans to vote. And we've also seen Bill Gates offering up $50 million. Are there questions here about, in the first instance, about the maybe even the legality of some of these interventions given funding laws, but also ultimately about their impact?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, that this cycle we have this very new and unusual dynamic where when Trump ran in 2016, it was a reversal of the dynamic that we'd seen in the Obama years, where the Obama campaigns were powered by small donors. And then in 2016, the establishment very much threw its weight behind the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, and Trump and the Republicans became the party of the grassroots small money donors. Now we've seen the pendulum swing back again, where Trump is now the figure who's getting the most money from the big money donors. And you mentioned Elon Musk. One irony of it is, if you look at the billionaires who are really propping up Trump in this campaign, which are Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, a Silicon Valley libertarian, for want of a better word, and Rupert Murdoch, of course, with Fox. Trump's running this scare campaign about immigrants, and all three of those men are immigrants to the United States. So worth pointing out the irony there. The Musk $1 million lottery is perhaps not legal, but people think that the Federal Elections Commission will not act on it, and he's clearly betting that they won't act on it. Because, by the way, the penalty for paying someone to vote is 5 years in jail, but it's pretty unlikely. I think that we'll see Elon Musk in jail for 5 years. But I think that the Elon Musk thing doesn't feel persuasive to voters. He's paying for the Get Out the Vote effort for Trump in Pennsylvania. He's paying people to door knock there. And political operatives have pointed out that door knocking by people who are being paid to do it is just going to feel different to people and be much less persuasive than door knocking by people who have a passion for the candidate. So whether or not all this money even makes a difference, who knows?
Well, and what's the role of the media so far in this campaign compared to historically? And I mean here, not just the mainstream media, but I'm thinking particularly about social media, foreign interference, and all the rest of it. And this whole question of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and lies. Are we seeing the media, either the mainstream media or in its own ways, taking any positions here that might be of influence? And more interestingly, what is happening, if anything, with misinformation, disinformation, social media, and the rest of it?
Yes, good questions. Well, first observation about this election is that the mainstream media has been sidelined a little bit by the candidates. And what I mean by that is that the candidates have not made many media appearances. Neither Harris nor Trump have been exactly accepting every interview request. Harris went on 60 Minutes, which is probably about as mainstream as it gets, but Trump declined to go on there. Instead, what they're doing, this is really the election of podcasts, and both candidates have made very splashy, very impactful appearances on podcasts that are finely targeted at groups that they want to reach. So, for instance, Trump, it was just announced yesterday that Trump's going to be going on Joe Rogan, which is the #1 podcast on Spotify, and which is kind of a Bible for young men in particular. And Trump's gone on a number of other podcasts that specifically reach young men and are much more granular in their reach in that way. Harris has gone on podcasts, like she went on a podcast that's basically a sports podcast that specifically reaches Black men, and she's gone on podcasts that reach young women. For instance, she was also on the cover of Vogue, and that barely made any impact compared with the podcast appearances. So it's kind of interesting to see that they've rejected mainstream media overtures for interviews and are instead going to podcasts. In terms of misinformation and disinformation, it's really interesting you ask about that, because I have not read a lot about it this cycle, and I wonder if that's because we're all missing the story, or whether social media people have maybe gotten a little more savvy about social media and the fact that the source of information on social media is more important. I don't know. It's an interesting question, and I think it's very telling that we haven't heard much about it.
Indeed, it is. And just to pursue the issue a little bit further about the media and new media, we used to hear a lot and be very concerned about foreign interference in elections. And has there been any evidence of manipulation and foreign interference by enemies overseas? And also, what about artificial intelligence and its ability to distort media messages and present fake news and what have you? Is there any evidence that AI is being used by parties domestically and the relative competing sides here in this?
Yeah, so a couple of threads there. It occurs to me that when we talk about social media, we do need to touch on the fact that one of the biggest social media platforms, which is, of course, X, formerly known as Twitter, is owned by Elon Musk and has become a bit of a cesspool. I think that people use it a lot less now because there's plenty of evidence that Musk has been tipping the scales and pushing Trump trolls to the fore on that platform. So it feels less trusted overall than it used to be. So maybe that's part of why we haven't been hearing as much this cycle about social media. In terms of AI, yes, there have been instances this cycle of AI being used to undermine electoral integrity. Voters have received deceptive phone calls that mimic candidates' voices, which is really scary to think about. Campaigns have used AI images in their ads. Donald Trump famously used a picture of Taylor Swift in a social media ad to imply that she was endorsing him. And of course, she was not. She came out and endorsed Harris. There are fears that there could be even more use of AI to suppress voter turnout, highly targeted messaging saying, hey, this voting booth is closed today, false information about polling stations. I think we'll need to watch very closely on the 5th for how AI is used to target messaging in that way. On foreign interference, the only thing I've heard is that there have been these specifically Russian trolls on X. But again, because X has been a bit sidelined from the mainstream ever since Elon Musk bought it, I don't think it's had the impact that it had in, say, 2016.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Musk and X, and I believe that they've been engaged in part two of a much broader campaign that seems to be going on in this election of trying to breed, sow seeds of distrust and doubt about the integrity of electoral processes. Of course, we saw this in the wake of the last election when basically Trump was questioning the whole basis and validity and integrity of the electoral system itself. And this seems to be a major continuing theme now. In fact, to the extent, too, I believe, that it's inciting people to potential violence, to the extent that I've seen stories that public officials around the country responsible for running elections are, quote, fortifying the election sites with increased security, extending to bulletproof vests for the workers, snipers, panic buttons, security fencing, bulletproof glass, all because they're so concerned about this sort of atmosphere that's been created that's going to lead to violence and attack on election officials.
Yeah, I once heard Lee Sales say something. This was after Trump was elected for the first time, and people were wondering what his presidency was going to be like. And she said, in her experience, covering the news for, her whole life, what she's realized is things never go quite how you expect they're going to go. And I think of that in this context because everyone's focused on another Jan 6, but everyone who was involved in Jan 6, many of those people have been given lengthy prison sentences. And the FBI really cracked down on everyone who was present that day. I wonder if this cycle, what we have to be concerned about is election day itself, rather than certifying of the election, which is a bit of a terrifying thought. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that the Republicans have been sowing real seeds of doubt, and also moving with a lot of lawsuits right now across the country intended to throw doubt on the results when they do come in. For instance, in Georgia, again, they're challenging the legality of the postal votes. And there was a court case there about whether or not hand counting ballots would be legal or not legal. All of this is designed to cast doubt on the election results when they come in.
Well, indeed, it does seem a pretty a broad range of measures that are sowing doubt and fear, but also creating a climate, I guess, of distrust that should the election results go a particular way, that they won't be accepted again. And this might lead to all sorts of things. I think even in the campaign, haven't we seen Trump himself putting out many threats, part of his campaign, to prosecute and punish, as he calls, perceived enemies of his politically, even talking about having to escalate to attack the enemy from within, who he describes as the radical left lunatics, by possibly even needing and necessarily calling out the National Guard and the use of the military. Is this the atmosphere of a democratic, open election
You cut
process?
out. Yeah, the rhetoric has been dialed up even for him. And I just read today the historian Robert Paxton, who's an historian of fascism, who wrote a book about Vichy France, an important one in the 70s. He has been traditionally reluctant to use the term fascist to describe Donald Trump, but he's just come out and said that January 6th and Trump's not just allowing violence to happen there, but actually egging it on. And now the rhetoric that he's used about the enemy within, he said, yep, this is fascism. He's comfortable using that categorization, which I thought was pretty sobering.
Well, as we wind up here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches with our guest, Amelia Lester, Deputy Editor of the Washington-based magazine Foreign Policy. Amelia, not least given some of the points we've discussed that seem to characterize, the dynamics and activities that are going on in the election campaign as we head ahead for 5 November, might give you pause if you were trying to pass a judgment on the state and health of democracy and its institutions and trust in America. But would you go along with the statement, and if so, why, that this is amongst the most important elections that the country's faced in a lifetime?
Oh, I mean, I don't think you need to add in a lifetime. It's one of the most important, full stop. And I think one dynamic that's been a bit underappreciated in the coverage here is people look at Trump's first term and they say, well, things didn't turn out quite as bad as we might have thought, setting aside the 500,000 unnecessary deaths because of pandemic mismanagement, setting aside the violent insurrection. The first 3 years of the administration were, they were okay. Everything didn't fall apart. And I see why people are susceptible to that line of thought. I mean, the stock market did great. Again, he didn't drop any nuclear bombs on anyone. I guess if I squint, I can understand that perspective. But I think the problem is, or the difference this time around, is that Trump was being protected. The American people were being protected from Trump there. And there were safeguards in place because there were sane people around him who checked his most anti-democratic and dangerous impulses. All those people are gone. Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation's kind of blueprint for what they'll do when Trump is elected, is a document designed to put in place a radical agenda, an extremist agenda. Now that all the sane people are gone from the Trump circle, I think the guardrails are gone. There are no guardrails. So I think a second Trump term, as a journalist, I know that I need to reach for impartial language, and this is impartial language. You read Project 2025 and you see how extreme it is, and you conclude that a second Trump term would be disastrous for democracy.
One could speculate in all sorts of ways, and briefly, I might just note that in that respect, I saw an interesting speculation based on some recent polling, which suggested there could possibly be a historic institutional double flip on this election. I don't know if you've seen this analysis, which suggests that there's a distinct possibility that the House could flip from being Republican controlled to Democrat controlled, and that the Senate could flip from being Democratic to Republican controlled. Of course, the various combinations and possibilities of those behind the presidency could also have an impact on the functioning of the American democracy, couldn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And just stepping back, it really highlights the undemocratic nature of the electoral college system at this point, because in the 2020 election, Joe Biden had a 7 million vote lead on Donald Trump, but then ultimately won the election because of 40,000 votes in 3 states. This time around, we might see an even closer margin in those 3 key states, even less than 40,000 votes, with meanwhile a similarly big lead in the electoral college. I've also seen analysis that says a tied electoral college is a possibility. And I think that the scary thing to contemplate with all this is we are talking about a really close election, and we're talking about when it is so close, you can see how conspiracy theories and the most dangerous impulses of the Trump camp to sow doubt and mistrust, they're going to find fertile ground. If you're talking about less than 20,000 votes, people are going to be more susceptible than they would be otherwise to those kinds of conspiracy theories and fear-mongering.
Well, indeed, from slightly more theoretical and bigger perspective, some have described this as a butterfly effect election race, the small changes, huge effects. Thank you very much, Amelia Lester, Deputy Editor of Foreign Policy Magazine based in Washington, D.C., but currently, Amelia, based here in Sydney. Thank you for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches.
Yeah, I would just amend and say a butterfly flaps its wings in Wisconsin, and then the entire world is changed. But yes, thanks for having me.